All right. Wow. We are live again. Another Friday. It's another good day to be joining all of you, whether you're watching on X or YouTube or you are watching the replay. I'm very proud to be hosting another week of the Vega for Congress Edgar Poe class series. I know some of you are looking at the title. I titled it Tulsi, Gabbard, Kash, Patel, Robert Kennedy, and Edgar Poe. If you're new here, if this is your first time and you came because you think I'm going to talk about Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel, and the nominations, you're right. I will for the first 10 to 15 minutes or so, and then we will get back to our regularly scheduled poll class. Although these reports that I give you before the class are actually not separate from the class. They're very much in line and in tune with what we intend to do here in the Bronx. And as some people know, and if you've been paying attention, you will know that, yes, the campaign is still very much in full swing. We haven't had a dramatic flare yet of a proper announcement, but that is coming soon, I promise, especially for those of you who've been asking, where is that? Also, please mind the camera as it will try its best to focus in and out. It's set to full HD, so I'm sorry if that scares you. As some people know, I went to Washington, D.C. on Wednesday. And I went down there. I got up at 5 in the morning, and we left around 6 to be there around 10:30 or so. We had people from all over the country, or at least all over the Eastern Seaboard. We had people from New York, like myself and the people in the room here, people from New Jersey, and then we had people as far south as North Carolina who came up to Washington, D.C. What were we doing there? Well, it's the same thing we were doing last week, which was we were passing out the Liars Bureau, although there is a difference. This time, Dennis Kucinich had put out a statement in regards to supporting Tulsi Gabbard for her nomination as DNI, and some other things had developed in that week since we were there. So there we were in Washington, D.C. We had done a little rally. Maybe if you tuned into the TLO YouTube channel, you would have seen that update. And not only that, but we went around virtually every single Senate office. And excuse the yellow box, it'll go away soon. We went to virtually every senator's office, like every single one. And we gave them the Liars Bureau. We gave them the pamphlet. What we did was something great, because we had so many people from different parts of the country who came in just for this single day. It gave us the strength and the sort of seriousness to demand to meet with aides and staff. And we went into Lindsey Graham's office, who's just like a total asshole, but he's office was forced to hear what we had to say because we showed up with like 8 people in the office, and we just went in there and we just decided, you know what, we're gonna meet with somebody here, and you're gonna give this to your advisors. That's exactly what everybody should be doing going to Washington, especially as we enter this sort of new period where we kept calling a transition period for the last 2 months, of course, because the end of the presidency of the Biden administration, and now we're beginning a new Trump administration, which what has been laid out is an intention to clean up the intelligence communities that have gone rogue and corrupt and have played with, I would say, the personal lives of Americans for the last 40 to 50 years or so. One of the things that was to our benefit was the fact that it was the 50-year anniversary of the Frank Church hearings that took place 50 years ago. These were hearings that exposed the rotten corruption and the rogueness of the intelligence agencies 50 years ago. And that's where we learned about the infamous heart attack gun. That's one of the more famous things that came out of these Senate hearings. And there were supposed to be a set of reforms. What the groundwork has been laid down by, or what has been laid down now is the groundwork for a new church committee hearing, meaning we can actually reform, or maybe even in some extreme cases abolish, some of these intelligence agencies that have gone amok and corrupt and have completely violated our First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendment rights, as people like Edward Snowden have pointed out. Now, also, I stayed an extra day in Washington, and I got to meet some of you who came up to me and recognized me, and I was in the Tulsi Gabbard hearing. I'm sure a lot of you, and and I don't blame you if you didn't watch that specific one. There were three hearings happening at the same time. There was, of course, Robert Kennedy, which was very, very sought after. There was the Kash Patel, and there was the Tulsi Gabbard hearing. But out of the three hearings, the Tulsi Gabbard hearing was the most important one, in my opinion. I will be honest with you. A lot of you saw my video that I made earlier in the week saying Tulsi Gabbard should be director of national intelligence, and I know a lot of you weren't happy with me. But quite frankly, I walked into that hearing fully expecting her to just walk back everything she said. Edward Snowden had put out a tweet just a few hours before they had gone into the committee hearing. It was something along the lines of, Tulsi Gabbard will be expected to renounce her support for whistleblowers. I encourage her to do so. I broke national security, and saying that is the modern equivalent of the Pledge of Allegiance. I fully expected her to also backtrack on everything. And I thought I was just going to see somebody who was going to try and get confirmed. What I saw was somebody who stuck to their principles as best as they could, not caving in or kowtowing to the several senators who asked her to denounce Snowden as a traitor. In fact, when she was first asked about Snowden, she said, well, Snowden broke the law, but his documents did reveal that there were egregious overreaches of the government that were violating the Fourth Amendment. I think that's what she was trying to say. But every time she tried to say that, they were interrupting her. But she still got it out at some points. There are some things, by the way, that being in the room you don't see on TV, right? So, for example, as the senators were taking their seats and the hearing was about to begin, she walked in with Tom Cotton. Now, Tom Cotton is the chair of that committee. And as some people may know, Tom Cotton, I've called him out on my X before. He was the one leading the anti-China, anti-TikTok ban. And he is the chair of that committee, and Tulsi Gabbard walked in with him. You saw scores of people fill up the hearing room. And what you also didn't see was the nervousness of one senator in particular named Todd Young, who kept shifting around in his seat and was acting like a child who could not sit still in the slightest. He kept kind of like doing this with his face and rubbing his temples, rereading folders, all while Tulsi Gabbard was talking. He definitely looked nervous. There were, the other thing you don't see is the fact that during the hearings, senators that were on the committee were just walking out of the room, going into some back room with an aide, leaving for prolonged periods of time, really, when Tulsi Gabbard was saying something important. What this told me was that this was all orchestrated. What that was done for public display. That was pretty much orchestrated and choreographed in a certain way. Not to say that Tulsi Gabbard, knew that, Senator Bennett was going to come at her the way he did. That was just, atrocious. And that was honestly completely psychotic, the way the senator went after her. But the people who were advising Tulsi clearly knew and tried to prepare her for the worst. And that is what we saw. We saw that she put up a reasonable defense. They thought it out. And so there I was in the room, sitting there, listening, watching everything going on. I got to talk to a lot of people. Some of you might be watching right now, who I met. And if so, hi, great to see you again. Thank you for coming on. So that's what we did in Washington, D.C. in the last couple days, and we intend to go back on a routine basis. That doesn't mean that everybody who came down this week, I might, but everybody who came down this week doesn't mean they necessarily have to come back again. But we are looking for new people to come with us and join us in Washington. I really think that this period coming up has to be more citizen-led and citizen-involved. I don't believe we are spectators. When I set out to run for Congress, I did so because I'm not a spectator. I intend to give people a vehicle and a format to be the change that they want to see through my campaign. And that's what we are doing. And so if you wish to be a part of what we're doing, if you wish to be a part of going down to trips in Washington, D.C., join us. You can sign up on our website, hit the volunteer button. You will be added to our list, and I will probably call you personally. And if you want to donate to our campaign so that we can actually fund these trips, votevega.nyc/donate. That's another way in which you can get a call from me. Now, with that being said, I think I'm going to end it there and I'm going to pass it off to Dennis Speed. Well, you know what? I'll let him introduce the class. But yeah, votevega.nyc if you want to get involved with what we are doing. And now I'll pass it back to Dennis Speed.
Let me first say hello to everyone and hope that some of you have had the occasion to read and read again the same offering that we're going to do tonight, which is the Edgar Poe Assignation, otherwise called The Visionary. With respect to what Jose just said, there is something important that might be contended. As he referenced, there are many people who have various questions about how one can support Tulsi Gabbard when Tulsi Gabbard is a apologist for Zionism and such things. While that is in one sense understandable, that is cowardly. Cowardice has become a pastime, a vocation of the American people. And there are all sorts of apologies for cowardice made by the American people. They talk about their preoccupation with identity politics. They talk about the corruption of the politicians. They talk about the deep state. They talk about the vast enterprise that keeps them oppressed, but they are never inclined to investigate as to whether or not it is true that, as Edgar Poe once said, there is no terror in my stories. The terror is in your soul. Now, this is important as an issue because what people can encounter, if they wish to encounter it, is the truth. It's not that difficult. And at the same time, you do pay a price for that. One of the things that happened, several things happened during the hearings, notably, the American people were told how American intelligence agencies had compromised, betrayed, and committed treason against the American people and the American Constitution in the middle of the hearing when Tulsi Gabbard described what she knew to be the case concerning Syria and the American enabling of the overthrow of the very Assad regime that she was being denounced for meeting with by the purported terrorists that blew up the World Trade Center. Now, whether terrorists blew up the World Trade Center is itself a question. But let's leave that question out. What she did was to successfully document that the United States was involved in, through the intelligence agencies, not through the people of the United States, was involved in an illegal, criminal, and in fact, treasonous operation. And that was right there in the hearings. Meanwhile, everybody's talking about why she should be saying this or that as she's speaking, and she's doing this. Not to mention that Edward Snowden directly intervened into the hearings yesterday, though he could not place himself in the congressional record, but he was placed in the congressional record. Did anybody notice that the individual that did that did not turn to Tulsi Gabbard immediately after introducing Snowden and say, Ms. Gabbard, can you comment to us as to why you would think that Edward Snowden would put this out today in defense? And how do you respond to this? How come that didn't happen? He seemed to be hostile. What you were seeing yesterday was a drama. Everything was orchestrated. And just as in championship wrestling, it's a bad idea to assume that what you're seeing is real. It's also a bad idea in most professional sports to presume that what you're seeing is real. By the way, it would be absurd to not understand that that entirety was orchestrated. And that what is involved right now is a battle which involves in particular the 18 intelligence agencies, British intelligence agencies, most emphatically, even more than many of the people in the American intelligence agencies, in trying to prevent the exposure of the fact that almost the entirety of the past 60 years of history and actions taken by most of the governments of the transatlantic world has been mythological. Almost nothing of what people believe has occurred for the reasons that occurred for those reasons. Nearly nothing in your life has been as you have been caused to think it to have been. It's not really significantly less of a shock than the character Neo goes through in the movie The Matrix. In fact, it's better to understand that that movie is itself a sort of cover-up of how actually manipulated people actually are. I want to I'll just illustrate something, which is the kind of thing that you can't put in front of the American people at the moment, not because the American people are dumb. It's not that, but because you won't get any backup on this if you try to assert these things to be true. I'm going to read to you from something from an individual, old friend of mine. He's now deceased, and he wrote for the publication Executive Intelligence Review, and he was writing this concerning Lady Diana. People have heard of Princess Diana. Princess Diana was killed on August 31st, 1997. And from the time of that killing, there had been some idea that that was an assassination. So I'm going to read to you from Scott Thompson's article about this. And I want you to follow carefully a few of the sentences, and then we'll go right into the post story. That Diana's view of the evil of the British crown was deeper than merely a reaction to the flawed personalities of her husband and in-laws was reflected in her 1994 through 1997 correspondence with an Executive Intelligence Review staff member. That was Scott Thompson, which began when she acknowledged receiving the October 28th, 1994 issue of Executive Intelligence Review's special report, The Coming Fall of the House of Windsor. Now, that title, The Coming Fall of the House of Windsor, is a paraphrase and a kind of homage to Edgar Poe's story, The Fall of the House of Usher. And it's because the investigative method that was used in that story is the same investigative method that was used in the report. So I'll just read what the report indicated and indicate after. The first in a series, later issued as an EIR special report of the same title, this feature documented, including from sources within the United Kingdom, that the World Wildlife Fund, co-founded in 1961 by Prince Philip and the notorious eugenicists Sir Julian Huxley and former Privy Council Secretary Max Nicholson, was committing genocide in Africa through the deployment of mercenary units used to stoke armed conflicts in order to control the continent's riches. It also showed that big game hunter Philip and others of the World Wildlife Fund had contributed to the extinction of the endangered species they claimed to protect. In the final March 1997 letter in the exchange, responding to documentation received on strategic issues, Diana's secretary wrote, quote, "The Princess of Wales asked me to thank you for your letter of the 19th of February and the most interesting enclosures. The princess was touched that you took the trouble to write following her visit to Angola. She was campaigning against landmines at the time. Your letter meant a great deal to the princess, who has asked me to send you her sincere regards." Now, that is March 1997. She was dead in August. It's a no-no if you're in the British royal family to contact us, those associated with Lyndon LaRouche, who had become notorious throughout the world as being part of an insane cult that talked about how the Queen of England, Elizabeth I, or second rather, was pushing drugs. But she contacted us, and there was this exchange, not only that one letter, but that's of relevance. Now, why is that relevant to the story of tonight, as the story we've been looking at? Venice and the idea of Venice has a very particular importance to the American intelligence services of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. That American intelligence service, which was founded by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and Benjamin Franklin, had successfully orchestrated as a conspiracy the American Revolution. That even included infiltrating various British secret societies much earlier, as Ben Franklin did with the British Hellfire Club from his late teens, 20s. It included infiltrating and in some cases creating Masonic organizations. Lynn, can you give me the Bravo for a moment? I want to read something from that. And it included, for example, the Marquis de Lafayette giving a charter to the Black Americans. They were becoming Americans in Boston, in particular, Prince Hall, so-called Prince Hall Masons, received their charter from the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, Lafayette, who had contentions with George Washington on the question of slavery, Lafayette and his associates, Hamilton and John Lawrence, who was the son of the head of the Continental Congress, Henry Lawrence, and was from South Carolina and had inherited slaves from his father and then tried to put those slaves into a freed Black American Revolutionary military unit. He was prevented from doing that by various of the other slave owners in Charleston, South Carolina, who asserted that they would prefer to turn the city over to the British rather than free their slaves. The contention and what went on around this, I tell that story because the Marquis de Lafayette formed an organization together with others called the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, which in the period of the 1780s and 90s in particular, played a certain important role in France prior to when the revolution just went crazy over there, which went crazy because British intelligence was paying two of the leaders of the French Revolution, Robespierre and Danton, and basically made sure that France paid the ultimate sacrifice. Many of the people in France, that is, paid the ultimate sacrifice and got guillotined, about 17,000 of them altogether. if they were supporters of the American Revolution in particular. So the intelligence services recognized, the American intelligence services, remember, the United States was not a strong nation. It was 13 colonies that didn't represent a primary military force. And they needed, in the aftermath of their own revolution, to try to consolidate power, which is what Alexander Hamilton was trying to do together with Washington and Franklin in the form of the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention of 1787 through the period from 1787 through 1789, when the United States becomes the actual republic. Before that, it was a confederacy. It was organized through an Articles of Confederation between 1783 and 1787. Then they began the process of creating the nation through the series of actions, including the Constitutional Convention. So Edgar Poe is a descendant of this, as is John Quincy Adams, who's the son of John Adams, but Edgar Poe is the grandson of David Poe, who was the quartermaster for the Marquis de Lafayette. But I went through a little bit of that just to illustrate something about the issue, which is right there in our time, of the difference between oligarchy, aristocracy, and what can be called free people. A free people don't operate at the behest or at the benevolence of the rich, which is the kind of thing that's now happening again in our country. Whatever you think about Donald Trump or Elon Musk or any of these people, you have to admit that basically everybody that you cite today as anybody of any significant influence has got several millions of dollars. There's almost nobody you bring up. You can bring up some hip hop creep, or you can bring up some British royal creep, or you can bring up somebody you happen to like who may not be a creep, but they all have tremendous amounts of money. What does that say about what has actually happened in America among the citizens with respect to the republic that was actually founded and the powers that actually exist in it? Martin Luther King didn't have a lot of money. When he died, he was damn near broke. How did he play the role that he played vis-a-vis particularly the Kennedy brothers in the 1960s? Why is he on the mall together with people, every one of which, not that there were differences, Franklin Roosevelt's a very different case, but every one of which comes from some level of privilege other than Abraham Lincoln, who's also on the mall in a big way. Why is there a connection between Lincoln and King and the way in which they impacted the United States and tonight as to what has to happen in Washington, D.C., and what you and I have to do? That's what we have to study. And the issue in terms of for us is that the wealth of the country is in its ideas. The wealth is not in the pockets of people. It's not in cryptocurrency, which I take it to be some sort of wealth that dead people use. I guess that's why it's called that. Or people who believe in virtual reality and don't understand that that is an oxymoron. What we're doing is that we're trying to make America intelligent again. We're not worried about making America great again or healthy again. Let's make America intelligent again. So we're talking about the idea of the intelligence services. Now, the issue of Poe is a useful one to take up here. Before we go to that, I just want to indicate one thing, which we're going to be referring to here. And it's in there's a about the issue of Venice and about democracies and republics. This is a passage written by his associate, Poe's associate, James Fenimore Cooper. And he says, a history of the progress of political liberty, written purely in the interests of humanity, is still to be desired in literature. In nations which have made a false commencement, false beginning, it would be found that the citizen, or rather the subject, has extorted immunity after immunity, as his growing intelligence and importance have both instructed and required him to defend those particular rights which were necessary to his well-being. A certain accumulation of these immunities constitutes the essence of European liberty, with the solitary and recent exemption in Switzerland. It is scarcely necessary to tell the reader that this freedom, be it more or less, depends on a principle entirely different from our own. Here, the immunities do not proceed from, but they are granted to the government, being, in other words, concessions of natural rights made by the people to the state for the benefits of social protection. I'm going to read that again. Here, the immunities do not proceed from, but they are granted to the government. So the rights you have don't come to you because the U.S. government gives you those rights. If you believe that, you are a subject. How many Americans believe that? How many people don't know that there is nothing in this government which does not come from the people to the state? You know, oh no, well that's, yeah, I suppose that's true. Actually, but you know, we can't really act like that. Cowardice. And there's where the issue of King comes in, because while people talk about creative, nonviolent, direct action as not being effective, that's exactly what was effective. In fact, if you compare it to Malcolm X, which people love to do, it was when Malcolm announced that he was going to join King in Selma, when he was in Selma, 3 weeks before he was in Selma, and said, we will join King in his voter registration drives and his voter registration campaign. This is right after Selma has happened. It's right after the march. And he says, and we're going to do that. Now, we are not, however, you know, we're not nonviolent, but we will join him. Now, this was critical because in the North, King's nonviolent tactic did not work, because northern cities were more violent and were more racist than the South, as would be shown in Chicago in 1966. And without Malcolm, without the Nation of Islam, King could not have carried that campaign out in the North. And 3 weeks later, Malcolm was dead. So the issue of creative, nonviolent, direct action and the unity of opposites to fight on behalf of people, see, this is something that requires a different kind of thinking. And the first thing that needs to be done for people who have suffered for various reasons, the oppression of fear, is to disabuse them of the deity of oligarchy or aristocracy or money. These things are not power. But if you believe that they're power, then it has a power over you. It's like voodoo. So you have the witch doctors of the oligarchy, the witch doctors of the aristocracy, the witch doctors of the media, and they control the minds of the people who, in like the Wizard of Oz. And no one understands or has not fully understood, even with some of the useful revelations that have happened around the person of Donald Trump. That is the way he ran for office and the laws he violated. That's been very useful. But Tulsi Gabbard walks into that position as a person who is an 8-term congressperson, or 8 years Congress, 4 terms Congress, and a 20-year veteran of the armed forces, who had joined because of 9/11. And while on all those counts, some of us may have legitimate criticisms of all of that, where she sits now and the battle that's going on right now is about something completely else. Let me pose this question to you. Do you realize that Robert Kennedy has said that he believes that the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, had something to do, as he puts it, with the killing of his uncle? And that the reason he believes that was that when he was 10 years old, he heard his father on the phone with the people from the CIA asking them, "Did you kill my brother?" Do you realize that that same Robert Kennedy says that his father was not killed by the person that's still in jail for killing his father? It says his father was shot from behind 3 times in the head by an individual whose name he has and he uses. Do you realize that this is the same Robert Kennedy Jr. that was denounced by virtually his entire family for running for office? So while people are looking at his appointment at Health and Human Services, if that goes through, what's it mean for him to be anywhere in the vicinity of actual power in the present government? See, it's important to look not merely at context, but you have to look at this process from a poetic standpoint. When I mean that, use that term, I will now demonstrate that. Again, I believe people have read the story. We have had the story read before, and we're just going to set this up a little bit. And I think here what we'll do, Kynan, is we'll run just the little narrative on Poe, because I just want people to understand the condition of Poe's life as he's writing the particular story he wrote about 2 years after what I'm about to cite, but just 2 years. And we'll just read that off. So you have those. Yes, thank you. Good. So you'll be seeing on your screen there. No, let's go past that. Let's go past that. The next one. Oh, here we go. Right. So Poe was born in 1809, probably by January 17th. So I think there's one before that. Let me just see. Give me a minute here. No, you're right. This is right. Okay. So I just want to have, this is so he was 22 years old in 1831, here, the 10th of February. So he's at West Point at that point, and he's about to be kicked out of West Point. And you'll see what goes on here. It's because he doesn't have any money. His stepfather, Mr. Allen, detested Poe. And what we're going to do here is just give you a little bit of the background. So this is from another cadet, David Emerson Hale. So he writes to his own mother. He says, quote, "I have communicated what you wrote to Mr. Poe, of whom perhaps you would like to know something. He ran away from his adopted father in Virginia, who was very rich, has been in South, I think that's South America, England, and has graduated at one of the colleges there. He returned to America again and enlisted as a private soldier, but feeling perhaps a soldier's pride, he obtained a cadet's appointment and entered this academy last June. He is thought a fellow of talent here, but he is too mad a poet to like mathematics." Something that will be meaningful for those of you who've read his story, The Purloined Letter. The next, this is from General Lucius Bellinger Northrop, who writes to his son-in-law about Edgar Poe. Edgar Poe at West Point was the wrong man in the wrong place. Although from an intellectual point of view, he stood high there as elsewhere. The records of the academy show that he was 3rd in French and 17th in mathematics in a class of 87. The severe studies and dull routine duties were extremely distasteful to the young poet. And at the end of 6 months, he applied to his adopted father, Mr. Allen, for permission to leave the academy, which request was promptly refused. He was shy, proud, sensitive, and unsociable with the other cadets. He spent more time in reading than in study. During his short stay at West Point, Poe made a high reputation for poetical genius. And when it was announced that he intended to publish his poems, great expectations were formed of the book. General Northrop informed me that the cadets eagerly subscribed for the volume. That's important because that's how it got printed. About 1,000 copies of it got printed. Okay, going to the 10th of March, same year, Poe writes to Colonel Sylvanus Thayer, who is the superintendent of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Quote, I intend by the first opportunity to proceed to Paris with the view of obtaining, through the interest of the Marquis de Lafayette, an appointment, if possible, in the Polish army. The object of this letter is to request that you will give me such assistance as may lie in your power to furtherance of my views. A certificate of standing in my class is all that I have any right to expect. Anything farther, a letter to a friend in Paris or to the Marquis, would be a kindness which I should never forget. Rolling on to the next month. So the volume is published Poe's poems. It's dedicated to the U.S. Corps of Cadets. He sends a copy to one of them, John Neal, bearing the inscription on the flyleaf, Mr. John Neal, with the author's best wishes. And then it just tells you what the contents of this was. And one of the things that was included is the poem, The Doomed City. And we're going to refer to that poem here in just a minute. In August of that year, Poe's brother, Henry Poe, is buried in the churchyard of the First Presbyterian Church. Notice of his death and funeral appears in the American and Commercial Daily Advertiser. Died last evening. W.H. Poe, aged 24 years. His friends and acquaintances are invited to attend his funeral this morning at 9 from the dwelling of Mrs. Clem. This the Clem family with which Poe lived. And we'll say a bit more here. So at the end of this, November, Poe writes to Allen, I was arrested 11 days ago for a debt which I never expected to have to pay and was incurred as much on Henry's account as on my own about 2 years ago. His brother had died. There was a debt. I would rather have done anything on earth than apply to you again after your late kindness. I am in bad health. If you will only send me this one time $80 by Wednesday next, I will never forget your kindness and generosity. So this was in 11th. So he needed it. He wanted by about a week later, 25th of November of 1831. Maria Clem writes in December to John Allen, as I am extremely distressed at Edgar's situation, I take the liberty of writing to you once more on his behalf. We have made every exertion for his relief, but our circumstances are too poor to afford him any. She was, by the way, writing to others for money for her own family. I have with great difficulty procured $20, which I will reserve for him with all my heart, but it is insufficient to extricate him. I beg that you will assist him out of his difficulty, and I am sure that it will be a warning for him as long as he lives to involve himself no further in debt. I am satisfied that except in this instance, he does not owe 1 cent in the world and would do well if you would relieve him. He is extremely distressed at your refusal to assist him and has no other resource whatever. As not being a resident of this city, Baltimore, he cannot take the benefit of the insolvents laws. I feel deeply interested in him, for he has been extremely kind to me as far as his opportunities would permit. I should consider it as one of the greatest obligations to myself and family if you will be so generous as to assist him for this time only. Okay, so that's the 5th of December. So now we come to Allen. So what happens? Allen writes to a John Walsh, not the guitarist, in Poe's behalf, but neglects to send his letter until the 12th of January. So wrote on the 7th of December to John Walsh to procure his liberation and to give him $20, meaning he's going to pay the Poe debt and give him $20 besides to keep him out of further difficulty and value on me. In other words, to say, but he won't recontact me for such amount as might be required. Neglected sending it on till the 12th of January, 1832. knowing that he needed it when he needed it by the 25th of November of 1831. So then finally, January of the next year, Poe would have been about to turn 23 years old. It says the Saturday Courier publishes Poe's Metzengerstein. It is doubtful that Poe received any financial reward for this tale and the 4 others published. So he's writing and he's not being paid at all. And that is his circumstance. What is relevant is he writing about that circumstance? Well, we'll take a look at that. This week, we probably won't get to Metzengerstein because we're going to try to go through and now do a bit on the question of this story. We will contend that this story has as its unnamed protagonist Lord Byron. Lynn, do you want to reference this, or should I just go ahead? You have something you want to say now, or you want to wait and go through the story first and talk about it? Okay, so let's do that. So Jose, why don't you start us off? You're the first reader, and one thing Diane usefully corrected us that is not with but through. Okay, remember that? Okay, fine. Gavin, you wanted to do this one here?
I'll use that.
Great.
All right. And if we can also pull up the story. Oh, great. Thank you. You may want to put me up on the side too with it. Yep. Great. For people at home. All right. So this is a version called The Visionary. This was published in January of 1834. If you've been part of our last 2 classes, you would know that this opening, these 2 quotes here from Schiller and Goethe are different from the later versions that were published and that you would find online. So without further ado, this is The Visionary by Edgar Poe. And it begins with a quote from Schiller's Wallenstein, Ich habe gelebt und geliebt. I have lived and I have loved. Then there's also a quote from Goethe. And there will be a slight correction, which I'll point out when we get to it. Und sterb ich denn, so sterb ich doch durch sie. And that translates to, and if I die, at least I die through her. Through her. I know the text says with her, but it actually is supposed to translate to through her. Through her. And I'll just read, and then maybe you can tell me when to switch. There is a name, a sound, which, above all other music, vibrates upon my ear with a delicious, yet wild and solemn melody, devoutly admired by the few who read and by the very few who think. It is a name not as yet, indeed, blazoned in the escutcheon of immortality, but there, nevertheless, heralded in character of the Tyrian fire hereafter to be rendered legible by the breath of centuries. It is a name, moreover, which for reasons intrinsically of no weight, yet in fact conclusive, I am determined to conceal. Nor will I, by a fictitious appellation, dishonor the memory of that great dead whose life was so little understood, and the received account of whose melancholy end is a tissue of malevolent blasphemies. I am not of that class of writers who, making some euphonious cognonym, the keystone to the arch of their narrations, can no more conclude without the one than the architect without the other. Ill-fated and mysterious man, bewildered in the brilliancy of thine own imagination, and fallen in the flames of thine own youth, again in fancy I behold thee. Once more thy form has risen before me, not as thou art, in the cold valley and shadows, but as thou shouldst be, squandering away a life of magnificent meditation in that city of dim visions, thine own Venice, which is a star-beloved city of the sea, and the wide windows of whose paladin palaces, gleaming with the fires of midnight revelry, look down with a sad and bitter meaning upon the secrets of her silent waters. Yes, I repeated, as thou shouldst be. There are surely other worlds than this, other thoughts than the thoughts of the multitude. I would almost venture to say other speculations than the speculations of the sophist. Who then shall call thy conduct into question? Who blame thee for thy visionary hours, or declare those occupations a wasting away of life, which were but the overflowings of thine everlasting energies? It was at Venice, beneath the covered archway, there called the Ponte di Sospiri, that met me, for the third or fourth time, the person of whom I speak. It is, however, with a confused recollection that I recall to mind the circumstances of that meeting. Yet I remember, how should I forget? The deep midnight, the bridge of sighs, the beauty of women, and the demon of romance who stalked up and down the narrow canal. It was a night of unusual gloom. The great clock of the piazza had sounded the fifth hour of the Italian evening. The square of the Campanile lay silent and deserted, and the lights in the old ducal palace were dying fast away. I was returning home from the Piazzetta by way of the Grand Canal. But as my gondola arrived opposite the mouth of the Canal San Marco, a female voice from his recesses burst suddenly upon the night in one wild, hysterical, and long continued shriek. Startled at the sound, I sprang upon my feet, while my gondolier, letting slip his oar, lost it in the pitchy darkness beyond a chance of recovery, and we were left at the mercy of the current, which here sets from the greater into the smaller channel. Like some huge bird of sable plumage, we were drifting slowly down towards the Bridge of Sighs, when a thousand flambeaux flashing from the windows and down the staircases of the ducal palace turned, all at once, that deep gloom into a ghastly and supernatural day. A child slipping from the arms of its own mother had fallen from an upper window of the lofty structure into the deep and dim canal. The quiet waters had closed placidly over their victim, and although my own gondola was the only one in sight, many a stout swimmer already in the stream was seeking in vain upon the surface the treasure which, alas, was only to be found in the abyss. Upon the broad black marble flagstones at the entrance of the palace, and a few steps above the water, stood a figure which none who then saw can ever since have forgotten. It was the Marchesa Bianca, the adoration of all of Venice, the gayest of the gay. But alas, the young wife of the old and intriguing Mentoni, and the mother of that fair child, her first and only one, who now, deep beneath the water, was thinking in bitterness of heart upon her gentle caresses, and exhausting its little life in struggles to call upon her name. She stood alone. Her small, bare, and silvery feet gleamed in the black mirror of marble beneath, her hair partly loosened, for the night, from its ballroom array, clustered amid a shower of diamonds, round and round her classical head and curls like the young hyacinth. A snowy white and gauze-like drapery seemed to be nearly the sole covering to her delicate form, but the midsummer and midnight air was hot, sullen, and still. No motion, no shadow of motion in that statue-like form itself, stirred even the folds of that raiment of very vapor which hung around it as the heavy marble hangs around the weeping Niobe. Her large, lustrous eyes were not, however, bent downwards to the grave, but her dearest hope lay buried, but riveted, strange to say, in a widely different direction. The prison of the city is, I think, the fairest building in all Venice. But how could that lady gaze so fixedly upon it, when her only child lay stifling at her feet? Yon dark, gloomy niche yawns right opposite her chamber window. What then could there possibly be in its shadows, in its architecture, that the Marchesa de Mentoni had not wondered at 1,000 times before? Nonsense! Who does not remember that, at such a time as this, the eye, like a shattered mirror, multiplies the images of its sorrow, and sees in a million far-off places the woe which is close at hand? Many step. Let me just finish the paragraph. Yeah. Many steps above the Marchesa, and within the arch of the water gate, stood, in full dress, the satyr-like figure of Mentoni himself. He was occasionally occupied in thrumming a guitar and seemed ennuied to the very death, as at intervals he gave directions for the recovery of his child.
Stupefied and bewildered, I had no power to move from the upright position I had assumed upon first hearing the shriek, and must have presented to the eyes of the agitated group a spectral and ominous appearance, as with my pale countenance and rigid limbs, I drifted down among them in that funereal gondola. All efforts were in vain. Many of the most energetic in the search were relaxing their endeavors and yielding to a gloomy sorrow. There seemed but little hope for the child, how much less then for the mother. But now, from the dark niche which had been before mentioned as forming part of the old Republican prison, and fronting the lattice of the Marchesa, a figure muffled in a cloak stepped out within reach of the light, and, pausing a moment upon the verge of the giddy height, plunged headlong into the canal. As in an instant afterwards, he stood with the still living and breathing child within his grasp upon the marble flagstones by the side of the Marchesa. His cloak, heavy with the water, became unfastened, and falling in folds about his feet, discovered to the wonder-stricken spectators the graceful person of a very young man with whose name the greater part of Europe was then ringing. No word spoke the stranger, but the Marchesa. She will now receive her child. She will press it to her heart. She will cling to its little form and smother it with her caresses. Alas, another's arms have taken it away and borne it afar off, unnoticed, into the palace. And the Marchesa, a tear is gathering into her eyes, those eyes which, like Pliny's own acanthus, are soft and almost liquid. Her lip, her beautiful lip, trembles. The entire woman thrills throughout the soul, and the statue has started into life. The pallor of the marble countenance, the swelling of the marble bosom, the very purity of the marble feet is suddenly flushed over with a tide of ungovernable crimson. And a slight shudder quivers upon the entire frame like a soft wind at Napoli about the rich lilies in the grass. Why should that lady blush? To this demand there is no answer except that, having left in the haste and terror of a mother's heart the privacy of her own bureau, she had neglected to enthrall her feet in their tiny slippers and utterly forgotten to throw over her Venetian shoulders that drapery which is their due. What other possible cause could there have been for her so blushing? For the glance of those large, appealing eyes, for the unusual tumult of that throbbing bosom, for the convulsive pressure of that trembling hand which fell, as Mentoni turned into the palace, accidentally upon the hand of the stranger, or for the singularly low tone of those unmeaning words which the lady uttered and departed. "Thou hast conquered," she said, or the murmurs of the water deceived me. "Thou hast conquered. 1 hour after sunrise, let it be." The tumult had subsided. The lights had died away within the piazza, and the stranger, whom I now recognized, stood alone upon the flags. He stood with inconceivable agitation, and his eye glanced around in search of a gondola. I could do no less than offer him the services of my own. In a hurried manner, he accepted my civility. An oar was obtained at the water gate, and as we passed together to his residence, he rapidly recovered his self-possession and spoke of our former slight acquaintance in terms of great apparent cordiality. There are some subjects upon which I take pleasure in being minute. The person of the stranger, let me call him by this title, who to all the world was still a stranger. The person of the stranger is one of those subjects. In height, He might have been below rather than above the medium size, although there were moments of intense passion when his frame actually expanded and belied the assertion. The light, almost slender symmetry of his figure promised more of that ready activity which he evinced at the Bridge of Sighs than that of that Herculean strength which he has been known to wield without an effort upon occasions of more dangerous emergency. With the mouth and chin of a deity, a nose like those delicate creations of the mind to be found only in the medallions of the Hebrew, full eyes, whose shadows varied from pure hazel to intense and brilliant jet, and a profusion of glossy black hair from which a forehead rather low than otherwise gleamed forth intervals, all light and ivory. His were features than which I have seen none more classically regular, except perhaps the marble ones of the Emperor Commodus. Want to take it now? And Robert, why don't you go after her? And then,
Yet his countenance was nevertheless one of those which all men have seen at some period of their lives and have never afterwards seen again. It had no peculiar, I wish to be perfectly understood, no settled, predominant expression to be fastened upon the memory, a countenance seen and instantly forgotten, but forgotten with a vague, intense, and never ceasing desire of recalling it to mind. Not that the spirit of each rapid passion failed at any time to throw its own distinct image upon the mirror of that face, but that the mirror-like, retained no vestige of the passion when the passion had departed. Upon parting from him on the night of our adventure, he solicited me in an urgent manner to call upon him very early the next morning. Shortly after sunrise, I found myself accordingly at his palazzo, one of those huge piles of gloomy yet fantastic grandeur which tower above the waters of the Grand Canal. I was shown up a broad, winding staircase of mosaics into an apartment whose unparalleled splendor burst through the opening door with an actual glare, making me sick and dizzy with luxuriousness. I knew my acquaintance to be wealthy. Report had spoken of his possessions in terms which I had even ventured to call terms of ridiculous exaggeration. But as I gazed about me, I could with difficulty bring myself to believe that the wealth of any subject in Europe could have supplied the far more than imperial magnificence which burned and blazed around. Although, as I say, the sun had risen, yet the room was still brilliantly lighted up, and I judged from this circumstance, as well as from the air of apparent exhaustion in the countenance of my friend, that he had not retired to bed during the whole of the preceding night. In the architecture and embellishments of the chamber, the evident design was to dazzle and astound. Little attention had been paid to the decora of what is technically called keeping, or to proprieties of nationality. The eye wandered from object to object and rested upon none, neither the grotesques of the Greek painters, nor the sculptures of the best Italian days, nor the huge carvings of untutored Egypt. Rich draperies in every part of the room trembled to the vibration of the low, melancholy music, whose unseen origin undoubtedly lay in the recesses of the red coral trellis work which tapestried the ceiling. The senses were oppressed by mingled and conflicting perfumes, reeking up from the strange arabesque censers, which actually seemed endued with a monstrous vitality as their party-colored fires writhed up and down and around their extravagant proportions. The rays of the rising sun poured in upon the whole through windows formed each in a single huge pane of crimson-tinted glass, and glancing to and fro in 1,000 reflections from curtains which rolled from their cornices like streams of molten silver, mingled at length fitfully with the artificial light, and lay weltering and subdued upon a carpet of rich liquid cloth of gold. Here then had the hand of genius been at work. A wilderness, a chaos of beauty was before me. Sense of dreamy and incoherent grandeur took possession of my soul, and I remained speechless. Ha, 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 laughed the proprietor, pointing me to a seat and throwing himself back upon an ottoman. There was, I thought, a tincture of bitterness in the laugh, and I could not immediately reconcile myself to the bienseance of so singular a welcome. Ha, 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 continued he. I see you are surprised at my apartment, my statues, my pictures, my originality of conception in architecture, in upholstery, absolute drunk with my magnificent. Ha, ha, ha. Pardon me, my dear sir, pardon me. I must laugh or die. Perhaps both, he continued after a pause. Do you know, however, he said musingly, that at Sparta, which is now Palatiori, at Sparta, I say, to the west of the citadel, among the scarce visible ruins, is a kind of socle, upon which are still visible the letters Lazim. They are, I verily believe, part of Galasma. How many divinities had altars at Sparta, and how strange that that of laughter should be alone surviving. But just now, to be sure, I have no right to be surprised at your astonishment. So, in other words, this is part of the word laughter, which he's writing in, saying in Greek.
Galasma translates to laughter.
Oh,
in Greek.
Yeah, galasma translates in Greek, from Greek to laughter. Okay, so he says, how many divinities had altars in Sparta, and how strange that that of laughter should be found alone surviving. But just now, to be sure, I have no right to be surprised at your astonishment. Europe, the world, cannot rival this, my regal cabinet. My other apartments, however, are mere matters of fact, ultras of fashionable insipidity. This is better than fashion, is it not? Yet this has to be seen to become the rage. That is to say, with those who could afford it at the expense of their entire patrimony. But I have guarded against any such profanation, with one exception. Here the pallor of death rapidly overspread his countenance, and as rapidly spread away. With one exception. You are the only human being beside myself who has ever set foot within its imperial precincts. I bowed in acknowledgement, for the unexpected eccentricity of his address and manner had filled me with amazement, and I could not express in words my appreciation of what I might have construed into a compliment. Here, said he, arising and leaning upon my arm, as he sauntered about the apartment. Here are the paintings of all ages, from the Greek painters to Semenbo, and from Semenbo to the present hour. Many are Simbue, and from Simbue to the present hour. Many are chosen, as you see, with little deference to the opinions of virtue. Here, too, are the chef d'oeuvres of the unknown great, and there, unfinished designs by men celebrated in their day, and whose very names the capacity of the academies have left to silence and to me. What think you, he said, turning as he spoke. I'll just finish the paragraph. What think you of this Madonna della Pieta? It is Guido's own, I said with the enthusiasm of my nature, for I had been poring intently over its surpassing loveliness. It is Guido's own. How could you have obtained it? She is undoubtedly in painting what the Venus is in sculpture. Ha, said he thoughtfully. The Venus, the beautiful Venus, the Venus of Venuses, the Venus of the Medici, the work of Cleomenes, the son of an Athenian, as much as it is the work of mine own hands. Part of the left arm and all the right are restorations. And in the coquetry of the right arm lies, I think, the quintessence of affectation. And Apollo, too. You spoke of Apollo. It is a copy. There can be no reasonable doubt of it. Sir, I will not bow to falsify, although begrimed with age. There is no inspiration in the boasted Apollo. And the Antinous is worth a dozen of it. After all, there is much in the saying of Socrates, that the statuary found his statue in the block of marble. Michelangelo was not original in his couplet. And we don't have Nana l'ottimo artista Elian concetto, c'è un uomo solo in se non circumscriva.
Even the greatest artist never has an idea that a single block of marble does not contain within itself.
Even the greatest artist does not have a single idea that does not have an idea that the single block of marble does not contain.
The idea that
Right.
Michelangelo once said this, was asked the question, how do you make the statues? He said, well, I just take everything away from what's not there, what shouldn't be there.
Okay. Going on. It has been, or should be remarked, that in the manner of the true gentleman, we are always aware of a difference from the bearing of the vulgar, without being able at once precisely to determine in what such difference consists. Allowing the remark to have applied in its full force to the outward demeanor of my friend, I felt it on that eventful morning still more fully applicable to his moral temperament and character. Nor could I better define that peculiarity of spirit which seemed to place him so essentially apart from all other human beings than by calling it a habit of intense and continual thought, pervading even his most trivial actions, intruding upon his moments of dalliance, and interweaving itself into his very flashes of merriment, like adders which writhed from out the eyes of the grinning masks in the cornices around the temples of Cybele. I could not help, however, repeatedly observing through the mingled tone of levity and solemnity with which he rapidly descanted on matters of little importance, a certain air of trepidation, a nervous inquietude of manner, which appeared to me unaccountable, and at times even filled me with alarm. Frequently pausing in the middle of a sentence, whose commencement he had apparently forgotten, he seemed to be listening, in the deepest attention, as if either in expectation of a visitor, or to sounds which must have had existence in imagination alone. It was during one of these apparent reveries, or pauses of abstraction, that, in turning over a page of Politian's beautiful tragedy, the Orfeo, which lay near me upon an ottoman, I found a passage underlined in pencil. It is a passage near the conclusion of the third act, a passage of heart-stirring pathos, a passage which, divested of its impurity, no man could read without a thrill, no maiden without a sigh. The whole page was blotted with fresh tears, and upon the opposite interleaf were the following lines, written, as I now write them, in English, but in a hand so very different from the peculiar and bold characters of my acquaintance that I had difficulty in recognizing it as his own. Thou wast all to me, love, for which my soul did pine, a green isle in the sea, love, a fountain and a shrine, all wreathed round with wild flowers, and all the flowers were mine. But the dream, it could not last, young hope that didst arise but to be overcast. A voice from out the future cries onward, while o'er the past, dim gulf, my spirit hovering lies, mute, motionless, aghast. For alas, alas, with me, ambition, all is o'er. No more, no more, no more. Such language holds the solemn sea to the sands upon the shore. Shall bloom the thunder-blasted tree, or the stricken eagle soar. And all my hours are trances, and all my nightly dreams are where the dark eye glances, and where thy footstep gleams in what ethereal dances by far Italian streams. Alas, for that accursed time they bore thee o'er the billow from me to tilted age and crime, and an unholy pillow, from love and from our misty clime where weeps the silver willow. That these lines were written in English, a language with which I had not believed their author acquainted, afforded me little matter for surprise. I was too well aware of the variety of his acquirements, as well as the strange pleasure he took in hiding them from the world, to be astonished at any similar discovery. But I must confess that the place of the date of the manuscript appeared to me singular. It had been originally written London, and afterwards carefully overscored, although not so effectually as to conceal the word from a scrutinizing eye. I repeat that this appeared to me singular, for I well remembered having asked him if he had ever met with some person, I think the Marchesa di Mentoni, who resided in England some years before her marriage, if he had at any time met with her in London, and his answer led me to understand that he had never visited Great Britain. I must here add that I have more than once heard, but of course never gave credit to a report involving so much improbability, that the person of whom I write was not only by birth, but in education, an Englishman. There is one painting, said he, turning to me with evident emotion as I replaced the volume upon the ottoman. There is one painting which you have not seen. And throwing aside the drapery, he discovered a full-length portrait of the Marchesa di Mentoni. Human art could have done no more in the accurate delineation of her superhuman beauty. The same sylph-like figure which stood before me the preceding night upon the steps of the ducal palace stood before me once again, but in the expression of her countenance, which was beaming all over with smiles, there still lurked that incomprehensible strain of melancholy which is, I do believe, inseparable from the perfection of the beautiful. On a scroll which lay at her feet were these words, "I am waiting but for thee." Her right arm lay folded across her bosom, and with her left she pointed downwards to a curiously fashioned vase. One small fairy foot, alone visible, barely touched the earth, and scarcely discernible in the brilliant atmosphere which seemed to encircle and enshrine her loveliness, floated a pair of the most delicately imagined silvery wings. I glanced from the painting to the figure of my friend, and the powerful words of Chapman's Bussy d'Amboise quivered instinctively upon my lips. I am up. Here like a Roman statue, I will stand till death had made him marble. Come, said he at length, approaching a table of massy silver, upon which were some beautifully dyed and enameled goblets, together with 2 large Etruscan vases, filled with what I took to be vin de Baraque, and fashioned in the same extraordinary model as the vase in the foreground of the portrait. Come, he said abruptly, let us drink. It is early, but let us drink. It is indeed early, he continued, as a cherub with a heavy golden hammer made the chamber ring with the first hour after sunrise. It is indeed early, but what matters it? Let us drink, let us pour out, like true Persians, an offering to that solemn sun which these lamps and censers are struggling to overpower. Here, having made me pledge him in a bumper, he swallowed in rapid succession several goblets of the wine.
To dream, continued he, resuming the tone of his desultory conversation, as he held up to the rich light of a censer one of the magnificent vases. To dream has been the business of my life, and I have therefore decked out for myself, as you see, a bower of dreams. Here, in the heart of Venice, could I have erected a better? You behold around you, it is true, a medley of architectural embellishments. The chastity of Ionia is offended by antediluvian devices, and the sphinxes of Egypt are stretching upon cloth of gold. Yet the effect is incongruous to the timid alone. Properties of place, and especially of time, are the bugbears which terrify mankind from the contemplation of the magnificence. Once I was myself a decorist, but the sublimation of folly has palled upon my soul. All this is now the fitter for my purpose. Like these arabesque censers, my spirit is writing in fire, and the whirling delirium of this scene is fashioning me for the wilder visions of that land of real dreams, whither I am now rapidly departing. Thus saying, he confessed the power of the wine, and threw himself at full length upon a chaise longue. A quick step was now heard upon the staircase, and a loud knock at the door rapidly succeeded. I hurried to anticipate a second disturbance, when a page of the Marchesa di Mentoni burst into the room, and, in a voice choking with emotion, faltered out the incoherent words, "My mistress, Bianca! Poison! Horrible! Horrible!" Bewildered, I flew to the sleeper, and endeavored to arouse him to a sense of the startling intelligence. But his lips were livid, his form was rigid, his beautiful eyes were riveted in death. I staggered back towards the table. My hand fell upon a cracked and blackened goblet, and a consciousness of the entire and terrible truth flashed suddenly over my soul.
All right. Any thoughts about this, first of all, before we go on?
I'll just say here so it doesn't look like there's an empty chair for the people at home.
Oh.
Because it'll look. Never mind.
Yeah. No, you want to be warm. Sure. Great. Oh, did you have something or not?
No, I just wanted to be here so that
Oh, so people can see it.
we would if people have thoughts they can share it in here. I'll take the laptop.
Yeah, see if anybody has anything to say. But the question is, what's going on? this story is operating on at least 3 levels.
I'm not seeing anything pertaining to the story.
Okay, well, fine, but people here are also what's going on. See, that this will show whether or not people can understand the hearings. This is your test as to whether or not you actually understand what's going on in the Congress.
I think that's a good litmus because we're getting a lot. Well, there's one person in particular who's being nasty about Gabbard Patel,
Oh, good.
even though we've gone past that.
No, that's
yeah.
fine. That's fine. That's not, no, but it's good because
Can they
because
hear?
You can, yeah. Just maybe speak up a little bit, but you could be heard.
so let's see if anybody has anything to say about this story. You have something?
Something that
Can you just go up so that he's right that way they can see
Okay.
you? Or how do you want to do that, Jose? You on or not?
just one observation.
Should he be where you are? I'm saying you want to leave the chair empty and everybody comes in and gets the chair.
If,
But also
if you want me to sit there,
closer
I can sit there.
Yeah, it's better. I'd rather that people see.
So just one observation I had about the ending, and this is just an observation, is that this aristocrat is once you're acquainted with the room and you're in this kind of, you see that there's this morbid interaction between the narrator and this aristocrat who's brought him into this kind of secret chamber. You find out that his understanding of this accumulation of all of these different historical pieces of art is to dream, and he describes it as that's the purpose of his existence, is to dream. And it struck me there's an interplay between that and the characterization of the beginning, where the character does seem to actually be there's a greatness to this character that he's not naming. In terms of just the way that this story literally plays out, I'm not really clear on how the narrator, if we're meant to take the narrator's word seriously at the beginning, that this is actually I guess what I'm saying is at the beginning of the story, I was taking the characterization of this ill-fated and mysterious man as having something to do kind of with the way that you accounted for Poe's own autobiography, that or his own historical character, that his name is sort of, there's a lot of lines that made me think of that. That great dead whose life was so little understood, and the received account of whose melancholy end is a tissue of malevolent blasphemies. So that to me struck me as very, very much related to all the things we've been discussing about Poe's legacy.
Right, but in the stories we've read, what do we know about Poe? What do we know about the way he writes? Like, think about The Spectacles, for example. Or what else do we read?
The Stranger.
No, just think about other stories. What other stories have we read?
Man in the Crowd.
It's Man of the Crowd, right? What else?
The Red Disc.
Mask of the Red Death, right?
Yeah.
Silence.
William Wilson.
Yeah. Let's think about these different stories, okay? So now look at this story for a minute. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned 1,000 hale and hearty members of his entourage and retired with them into one of his castellated abbeys.
There seemed to be a thought about the palace of Prince Prospero and the particular, when there was sort of a list of the particular furnishings in this apartment, except it seems in direct contrast to prosperity. It's something in opposition to that, sort of a.
Does anybody here know who Federico Fellini is? That would help. That's a problem.
The movie?
Yeah,
Movie guy?
the movie director.
The Satyricon feast, or is that what it's called?
Well, that's one of the things he did.
Vitae or something?
Yeah, La Dolce Vita.
Mm.
La Dolce Vita.
I think I was
Sweet life.
I think I was overcomplicating it and then kind of missing the point of. Now that I'm looking at the beginning again,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like a much more straightforward kind of sarcasm. Or
Okay, so for what do you mean? Go ahead.
well, like he says, this thing about how he doesn't have to put a name at the top of his story to make it. What is it? He says, I am not of that class of writers who, making some euphonous cognomen the keystone to the arch of their narrations, can no more conclude without the one than the architect without the other.
Mhm.
So this, whoever this character is, whatever this character represents, is not, it doesn't actually, he's saying, I don't need, this doesn't have to be about a specific person, or it doesn't have to, this isn't like some historical fiction in that sense. And it seems, in bringing to mind something like the Mask of the Red Death, there is it does seem like a kind of straightforward attack against this character and as a Venetian.
Well, we know a few things, right? First of all, this story is all occurring in translation, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Wait, that's right. Let me see this real quick. Where does he say that? He says that. No, it's at the end, I think.
Toward the end.
Yeah, yeah. Something about
That these lines were written in English right after the poem. Go to right at the end of the poem.
that these lines were written in English, a language with which I had not believed their author acquainted, afforded me little matter for surprise. Oh, right. So he's saying like, oh, I didn't think this guy could write in English.
No,
Well,
he didn't even
you're
think he was
saying that-
acquainted with English.
Yeah.
I mean, the story is occurring in Italian.
Wait, I'm
The
not sure.
entirety of this is in Italian.
Well, is that what that? Because I took these lines to mean he looked out of the book and he saw words written in English and he was surprised.
Right.
So
He
Well,
says
but-
a language with which I did not believe their author acquainted. So who does he think the author is?
It's very, yeah,
whoever this guy is.
Thinks he's
Yeah.
an Italian, yeah.
yeah, right. So it's
He thinks that the guy is an Italian, but he says at the end of that paragraph, let's read the paragraph.
if he had at any time met with her in London. Oh no, he said I well remember having asked him if he had ever met with some person. I think the Marchesa di Mentoni.
Wait, should we just read the whole paragraph?
Go ahead, right. Read the whole paragraph because there's the whole point of this.
You want to do it?
Yeah, sure.
Sure, then do it.
That these lines were written in English, a language with which I had not believed their author acquainted, afforded me little matter for surprise. I was too well aware of the variety of his acquirements, as well as the strange pleasure he took in hiding them from the world, to be astonished at any similar discovery. But I must confess that the place of date of the manuscript appeared to me singular. It had been originally written London, and afterwards carefully overscored, although not so effectually as to conceal the word from a scrutinizing eye. I repeat that this appeared to me singular, for I well remembered having asked him if he had ever met with some person, I think the Marchesa di Mentoni, who resided in England some years before her marriage, if he had at any time met with her in London. And his answer led me to understand that he had never visited Great Britain. I must here add that I have more than once heard, but of course never gave credit to, a report involving so much improbability, that the person of whom I write was not only by birth, but in education, an Englishman.
Okay, so what are we saying here?
Well, he also makes another reference to it before the poem. The whole page was blotted with fresh tears, and upon the opposite interleaf were the following lines written, as I now write them in English, semicolon, but in a hand so very different from the peculiar and bold characters of my acquaintance that I had difficulty in recognizing it as his own.
So he's
So-
also disguised his handwriting. Just
Or
to get
or is
back
it the
to-
Marchesa's handwriting? Or
Well, that may be, but apparently the person, I thought the same thing. But the narrator seems to think he wrote it.
Well, it's clear he wrote it. Well, I
Okay,
don't want to
Blotted
say
with fresh
it's
tears,
clear,
I mean.
but he's talking about what's.
Why don't you go up?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
That's right.
Okay.
Sit there because we may be back up soon. We're
Okay.
beginning to get that, and that's what I want to do. for this
Just to
contract.
remind people that the story is called the assignation, which means the meeting and
Well,
Right.
a romantic
It
meeting.
is.
a romantic meeting.
It's
It's a
a
hookup.
It's a hookup.
it's a,
So
No, it's
he's
a hookup is what it is. okay?
he's hypothesizing the writer is of this story, or the friend who's brought into this weird chamber is hypothesizing, I think at the end, that there was some type of meeting between the Marchesa and this person who he has now thinks is an Englishman. Okay, so let's take that as a hypothesis for a minute. And what he's saying in here is this is obviously a love poem. I think that's pretty obvious. That's thou wast that all to me, love, for which my soul did pine. A green isle in the sea, love, a fountain and a shrine, all reef round with wild flowers, and all the flowers were mine. But the dream, it could not last. The dream again, young hope, right? So has this dream that maybe they're going to be together. But alas, with me, ambition, all is o'er. So he's writing this poem when this is ended. No more, no more. Such language holds the solemn sea to sands upon the shore. Shall bloom the thundered blasted tree of or the stricken eagle's soar. And all my hours are trances, and all my nightly dreams again. And where the dark eye glances, and where thy footstep gleams, in what ethereal dances by far Italian streams. So the girl, the woman, the Marchesa, presumably has been taken away from where they were, which is presumably since the first assignation, and maybe there's more than one. We'll come back to that, I'm sure.
Well, there was one successful one.
Has been one successful one in London. Alas, for that accursed time. So he's writing this, what at this time, what happened? They bore thee o'er the billow from me, and to titled age and crime. Okay. And the titled age, if we think back to the figure at the beginning who's standing above them, the Marquise of the palace, looking down, giving directions. I mean, alternately, what is he doing? Fiddling or something, and giving orders about his presumed child. So he's the titled age and crime, and to an unholy pillow from love and from our misty clime, which is generally how London is referred to, as a misty clime, where weeps the silver willow. So she was taken away, and she was taken away to get a titled, or to a titled age and crime. We don't know if she was a titled person to begin with. I mean, not all of that is said. Should I say a couple things about Venice
What time is
quickly
it now?
now?
it's
7:49.
Let me do one thing here.
Okay,
before you
I
do
wanted to say one other thing, which is one of the things of the nature of the stories we've been reading is nothing. And this goes to what Robert was saying at the beginning, because you have one impression that it's something, but nothing is what it appears to be. And this is particularly true of Venice, and we can talk more about that. But everything is secret and mysterious and has several layers, and each one becomes more kind of insidious than the next.
Yeah. So the main thing here is just because we're not going to speed up, but the narrator is a lunkhead. I mean, this guy gets almost everything wrong. And he tells you if you read the story. Just look at the story.
Oh yeah, he doesn't know which painting's real, which one is a fake.
That entire section, he's all impressed by these different things. He's claiming that there's a Guido Reni there, and the guy's saying, yeah, the same as if I had made it. And he actually is a painter also. He's painted the picture.
The Marchesa, right?
Yeah, he's painted the picture. So he knows what's fake and what's real. He talks to him about the Venus and the Apollo, and these things aren't worth anything.
Oh, sorry. No,
Yeah. No, it's fine. Exactly. So I mean, well, actually, I don't want to try to impose. I just want to point out the narration is filled with errors. The narrator, he's saying several things that he doesn't understand. The reason is because the story does not work on the level of narration. No story does.
Right.
Nor does your life, by the way. Nor did the hearings today, nor does the person you're calling Tulsi Gabbard or any other people you're calling who you think they are. None of these people are who you think they are. You're in a United States in which you've had a series of elections in the middle of a coup that happened on September 11th, where people from this country carried out and killed 3,000 people plus. You know, everybody's walking around like this is not what happened. So almost every transaction in every way done by every person is itself a lie. Just as an example. So just to understand why it's not hard to understand why this would be true in the story, that's what your life is. You've been living that way. So it should be easy for you to understand how the narrator thinks, because he mostly doesn't. And so the business about there's a name, a sound, which above all other music vibrates upon my ear with a delicious. I don't mean that it's a triviality. It's a beautifully written story. Yes. But what's it about? Like, who takes the kid? And why does it say, let's just read it again. But the Marchesa, she will now receive her child. She will press it to her heart. She will cling to its little form and smother it with her caresses. Alas, another's arms have taken it away and borne it afar off, unnoticed, into the palace. What is that? What happened? Why do you assume that the people that jumped in the river were trying to get the kid?
But we don't even know how the child got into the water. We
That's
don't
right.
know.
We don't know that. We don't even know how the child got.
It fell from
Wait a minute. We don't know how the child got.
People don't stand over the Venice Canal with a baby in their arm that drops into the water.
That's for certain.
And it falls into this deep pit of what they call an abyss, right? Water.
Oh, there's a lot of
There's a lot of that in Venice.
there's a lot of bodies in the Grand
But the way the baby is recovered is very strange, because the whole thing about the story is that this guy is now famous in Europe.
Right.
So he's like this figure. He's been created, or he from the viewpoint of the
Go
narrator.
back up. That's good. Yes, this is good, because we're just trying to move ahead because it's almost at 8 o'clock. Go ahead.
Well, just along the line of what you're saying, Dennis, that I'm sure there are lots of details like this in the story, but the one that really stuck out to me as I was reading it again is that the way the child appears back out of the water, and then all of a sudden he's there, and they take off the wet cloak, and it's this handsome young man. That struck me as it could have easily been the consequence of a kind of conspiracy to have this figure perform a heroic act in public, or at the very least, that occurring in that way in the narrator's mind is the same as him knowing that he's famous later. As for how that ties into him ending up going back to the guy's apartment and the whole suicide and the love thing between the guy and the Marchese, I don't know.
Well, I mean, that I think goes more to what Lynn brought up 2 weeks ago about this being about Lord Byron. I mean, I was reading this again just before the poem. It was during one of these apparent reveries or positive extraction that, in turning over the page of Politian's beautiful tragedy, the Orfeo, which lay near me upon an ottoman, I found a passage underlined in pencil. It is a passage near the conclusion of the third act, a passage of heart-stirring pathos. And I think, of course, Orfeo is, I looked it up, is just the Italian version retelling of Orpheus, right? And I think people are familiar with the Greek tragedy Orpheus, right? Where Orpheus goes onto the underworld and he does this, grandeur act of love. But at the end, he looks back because the condition was you can take her out of the underworld if you don't look back. But at the end, he looks back, right? And thus she disappears because, right? And, but then he continues, a passage which divested of its impurity, no man could read without a thrill. So I think that's the part he's referring to, because he says the conclusion of the third act. I don't know how many acts it was, but no man could read without a thrill, no maiden without a sigh. The whole page was blotted with fresh tears, and upon the opposite interleaf were the following lines written. So this guy reads this, and he's so, I don't know, he's impassioned clearly because he's crying, right? Because there's tears on the page that he's like writing this poem, right? So he's comparing Orpheus to himself. And that's why I thought about what Lynn brought up 2 weeks ago with Lord Byron, about how this is about Lord Byron, right? Because knowing more of Lord Byron's, hold on, that does get picked up. I got to figure out how to get that. But knowing more about Lord Byron's, kind of romantic history and the way he died and the way that he apparently, one of his lovers died, which, goes to show, I think this is like a sort of not a criticism, but like a whole.
Yeah, let's fill that in for people at home. Let Lynn go now. And one problem is this one we need another hour, which would be best to take now.
Yeah.
So we probably won't.
Yeah, we have 3 minutes before the 8 o'clock.
Exactly.
Well,
So she's got-
Byron had a really wild life. He was multi-sexual.
You mean bisexual or
Multi.
Multitasking.
And
all
he
genders?
he broke up with his wife because of his creditors and a divorce. He wintered in Venice, and he fell in love with Mariana Seghetti, in whose Venice house he was lodging. And she was soon replaced. She was married. That was soon replaced by a 22-year-old Margherita Cogni. Both women were married. Cogni could not read or write. She left her husband to move in with Byron. They would fight often, and at one point Byron told her to spend the night in his gondola, and he went to spend the night in his gondola. He asked her to leave the house, and she threw herself into the Venetian canal. The next year he goes to Rome. Then he returns to Venice, and then he meets the 21-year-old Countess Giaccoli, who found her first love in Byron, and he asked her to elope with him. So she was a local aristocratic, young, newly married woman, and they lived together, and she left her husband, and so on. And he went around Europe. He was actually with her for a couple of years. And eventually she abandoned her husband to live with him. Ultimately, I think her father, Count Gamba, got her back. But
And let's
that's
go to the Bravo now. because
that's sort of
Bravo's
his history.
just so they know.
Um,
about this.
3 years before Poe wrote this, his friend and James Fenimore Cooper had written a book about Venice called The Bravo. And Dennis already read one section of that.
Yeah, he was the head of the Society of Cincinnatus for the United States.
Cooper was the head of the Society for Cincinnatus for the United States. And he says of the book, in spirit, it's the most American book I ever wrote. And he's really writing it to give people a sense of Venice, in the sense of what Dennis was referring to at the beginning, the difference between a republic and a monarchy. And while he talks about Venice, he's really referring in many, many ways to this Venetian or oligarchical mode of thinking, and particularly the British. Remember that this is only 40 or 50 years after the American Revolution. And as Lincoln often said, you already, with 2 generations, people had lost the sense of what the American Revolution was really all about and how important the government was and what the government is. So he wants to use this image of Venice to give, and the Venetian system to give people a real sense of the evil of oligarchy. And this is it's a system where, frankly, nobody is free, including even the noble families or the Doge himself. So you have a system where you have 300 noble families, and this Grand Canal is lined by these magnificent, and when I say it, they're all described as gloomy grandeur or morose magnificence. So you get this beauty, except it's all, gray and bizarre. To wear a mask in Venice it's sacred. You cannot challenge anybody from wearing a mask. And the mask is to disguise who people are. So you have a system where people don't even know there's a system governing them. 300 noble families in these houses on top of the canal that look gloomy and morbid and so on, but they're magnificent. Then you have a council of 10, which is selected from this group of 300 because the 300 is too big to govern. But then internal to that, you have a council of 3, which is entirely secret, including to the nobles. People don't even know, and they have absolute dictatorial power. And then you have a doge, which sits on top of that, but that's not like the president or even a king. It's just somebody that is almost like a mannequin prince who's there for the ceremony. And this group determines what is happening, but they themselves are determined and controlled by, it's really a classic example of the Fondi principle that LaRouche often talks about. So it's not the individuals, but it's the system itself, which is completely evil. There's much, much more to it, but it's more sophisticated even than a monarchy, which is supposed to be the whole idea of the divine right of kings. They claim their right to call Venice a republic because there isn't one person which has a divine right. It's allegedly an elected system, but nobody is elected. Anyway, that's all I'll say about it.
All right.
Okay, wait. There's a punchline. It's right at the beginning of the story.
Okay.
Hold on. Move. So people understand this. We can take that. We will have to conclude now, but let me read you the beginning of the Bravo novel, chapter 1. I stood in Venice on the Bridge of Sighs, a palace and a prison on each hand. I saw from out the wave her structures rise, as from the stroke of the enchanter's wand. 1,000 years their cloudy wings expand around me, and a dying glory smiles o'er the far times when many a subject land looked to the winged lion's marble piles, where Venice sat in state enthroned on her 100 Isles, Lord Byron. So this is right. So there's a quote that Cooper uses at the beginning of the Bravo, which is written 3 years before Poe's poem. And Cooper is the head, the American head of the Military Intelligence Society, which Edgar Poe is an hereditary member of through his grandfather.
All right.
They mentioned the Bridge of the Sighs in the assignation too.
Sure,
Yeah.
that's the Versailles is like that's the place in Venice, man. That's the place.
Yeah, that and the Rialto.
So probably we obviously have to discuss. I would invite people at home to think about it, or at home, wherever you are looking at this. And I am serious. What happened in this story is what happened in the hearings. I mean that. And it's useful to stop and think, because the problem is we have to make America intelligent again. To do that, we're going to have to develop an independent intelligence service. It's not going to come from the 18 intelligence agencies, and it's not going to come from any effort down in Washington. It has to be done independently by the American citizens. And that is what the subject actually is of what we're doing.
Okay, I'm going to close this out.
Very good.
Okay.